For 3 years, no one had willingly stood within 10 feet of Alpha King Lucien Blackwood. Not because he demanded it. Not because guards forced it. People simply chose distance whenever he entered a room. The Grand Moon Hall shimmered beneath thousands of crystal lights suspended from vaulted ceilings nearly 40 feet overhead. Silver banners bearing the crests of every major pack hung between towering marble columns, while a string quartet played softly from a raised balcony. More than 300 guests filled the hall tonight. Alphas in tailored formal coats. Betas draped in expensive silks. Noble families eager to witness history. Tonight was the moon-choosing festival, the most anticipated event of the year. By sunrise, the Alpha King was expected to choose a Luna. Yet despite the music, despite the laughter, despite the flowing conversations, an invisible circle surrounded the king. No one crossed it. Lucien stood alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. His black formal coat fit his broad frame perfectly, and the silver wolf crest pinned to his chest caught the light whenever he moved. Which wasn't often. He barely spoke. Barely acknowledged anyone. From across the hall, people watched him the way travelers might watch a distant thunderstorm. Fascinated. Respectful. Careful. Rumors followed him everywhere. Some said he could sense lies before they were spoken. Others claimed his wolf was larger than any seen in generations. Children whispered stories about his silver eyes. Adults lowered their voices whenever his name entered a conversation. Yet the truth was simpler. Lucien Blackwood was powerful. Powerful enough to make others uncomfortable with their own weaknesses. His presence seemed to pull every sound toward silence. Every movement toward stillness. Every eye toward him. And still, he stood alone. Across the ballroom, a server nearly dropped a tray after accidentally glancing toward the king. A young noblewoman immediately looked away when Lucien's gaze drifted in her direction. Even several visiting alphas positioned themselves on the far side of the room, pretending interest in conversation while carefully avoiding direct contact. It was almost as if the entire kingdom had gathered for a celebration centered around a man nobody actually wanted to approach. Lucien noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes moved across the room once before returning to the moonlit gardens outside. Expression unreadable. Calm. Detached. Yet there was something else hidden beneath that composure. Something few people ever saw. Loneliness. Not the loneliness of being unwanted. The loneliness of being unreachable. Of standing above everyone while belonging nowhere. The orchestra shifted into a slower melody. Glasses clinked softly. Laughter rose and fell like distant waves. But around the Alpha King, silence remained. A nobleman finally gathered enough courage to take 2 steps in Lucien's direction before immediately changing course and greeting someone else instead. Nearby, several guests exchanged nervous smiles. Nobody seemed willing to be first. Nobody seemed willing to risk standing before the king alone. And somewhere near the back of the hall, unnoticed by nearly everyone present, a shy Omega carrying a tray of sparkling cider paused for just a moment. Her name was Olivia Hart. She lowered her eyes before anyone could notice her staring. But unlike everyone else in the room, she wasn't looking at the Alpha King with fear. She was looking at him with curiosity. And for the very first time that night, someone wondered what it felt like to be the loneliest person in a room filled with hundreds of people. Olivia Hart had mastered the art of becoming invisible. She moved through the Grand Moon Hall carrying a silver tray balanced carefully between her hands, weaving between clusters of nobles who never bothered learning her name. The conversations flowed around her like a river she was never invited to join. She refilled glasses. Collected empty plates. Offered polite smiles that rarely received a response. It was easier that way. Easier to remain unnoticed than to risk becoming the target of someone's amusement. Watch where you are going, Omega. The sharp voice struck before Olivia could step aside. A woman in an emerald gown pulled back dramatically as though Olivia had committed some terrible offense. Several nearby guests glanced over. Olivia immediately lowered her eyes. "I am sorry, ma'am." The noblewoman examined the sleeve of her gown. There was not a single drop on it. Still, she sighed heavily. These servants become more careless every year. A few people chuckled politely. Olivia felt warmth creep into her cheeks. She offered another apology and moved away before the embarrassment could settle deeper. Moments later, she slipped into a quieter corridor beside the ballroom to exchange her empty tray for a fresh one. The silence there felt like relief. She inhaled slowly and pressed a hand against her chest. Her heartbeat finally began to settle. "You should stand up straighter." Olivia looked up. Martha, the elderly head housekeeper, stood nearby holding a stack of folded linens. Her gray hair was pinned neatly beneath a lace cap. "Sorry?" Olivia asked. Martha shook her head gently. "You spend your whole life trying not to take up space. People start believing you do not belong in it." Olivia managed a small smile. Martha had always been kind. "I belong in the kitchen." "You belong wherever the moon goddess placed you," Martha replied. Before Olivia could answer, a bell rang from the ballroom, signaling the next course of the evening. The older woman squeezed Olivia's shoulder and disappeared down the corridor. Olivia returned to work. As she stepped back into the crowded hall, the noise immediately swallowed her again. Music floated beneath crystal chandeliers. Noble families laughed over expensive wine. Young women adjusted elegant gowns while secretly positioning themselves where the king might notice them. Yet Olivia noticed something strange. Despite all their efforts, every path still curved away from Lucian Blackwood. No one lingered near him. No one approached. No one spoke unless spoken to. He remained beside the towering windows exactly where he had been before. Alone. The realization tugged unexpectedly at her heart. She understood loneliness. Not his version of it, perhaps. Her loneliness came from being overlooked. His seemed to come from being untouchable. Across the room, their eyes almost met. Olivia immediately looked away and focused on her tray. Yet a strange feeling lingered. Not fear. Not admiration. Something softer. Curiosity. As if behind the title, behind the power, behind every whispered rumor, there was simply a person standing by himself while hundreds celebrated around him. And for reasons she could not explain, that thought stayed with her long after she walked away. The evening stretched on, and the grand moon hall seemed to grow brighter with every passing hour. Servants replaced candles. Musicians changed melodies. Noble guests drifted from conversation to conversation like leaves carried by a gentle current. Yet Olivia noticed something no one else appeared willing to acknowledge. The farther the celebration moved around the room, the more isolated the Alpha King became. She carried a fresh tray of sparkling cider through the crowd, careful not to draw attention to herself. Laughter echoed nearby. A group of young noblewomen stood near one of the marble columns, speaking in voices just loud enough to be overheard. "My father says the king has rejected every proposal for years." One of them adjusted a diamond bracelet around her wrist. "Maybe he simply enjoys making people nervous." Another shook her head. "No. My aunt met him once. She said standing near him felt like standing in front of a storm cloud." The women laughed softly. Olivia continued walking, but their words lingered in her mind. A storm cloud. Was that really how people saw him? She glanced toward the windows again. Lucian remained there, one hand resting lightly behind his back. His expression had not changed all evening. Calm. Controlled. Distant. Yet Olivia found herself paying attention to the details others ignored. The slight tension in his shoulders. The way his gaze lingered on the moonlit gardens instead of the guests. The fact that he never once interrupted anyone, never demanded attention, never acted like the frightening ruler everyone described. It felt strange. The stories and the reality did not seem to match. As she crossed toward the refreshment table, Olivia nearly collided with a young servant carrying linens. "Sorry," he whispered. "I heard the council arrived." Olivia blinked. "The Royal Council?" He nodded quickly. "All of them. They came through the east entrance a few minutes ago." Before she could ask another question, he hurried away. Curiosity tugged at her. The Royal Council rarely attended social events without purpose. A few minutes later, she noticed them gathered near one of the private balconies overlooking the ballroom. Several council members stood in a tight circle speaking quietly. Their expressions looked serious, concerned. One older advisor shook his head while another folded his arms across his chest. Whatever they were discussing, it did not resemble festival conversation. Olivia lowered her gaze and continued working, but a strange feeling settled in her chest. Something important was happening beneath the surface of tonight's celebration. Something nobody wanted the guests to notice. The realization made her glance toward Lucien once more. To her surprise, she found him already looking in the direction of the balcony. Not at the council members themselves. Beyond them. As though he already knew exactly what they were saying. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Not anger. Not irritation. Weariness. Deep and quiet. The kind that came from carrying a burden alone for far too long. Then it disappeared. His expression returned to stone. Around them, the festival continued. Music filled the air. Crystal glasses reflected golden light. Guests smiled and laughed beneath silver banners. But Olivia could not shake the feeling that tonight was not unfolding the way everyone expected. And somehow, without understanding why, she found herself worrying about the king standing alone beside the window. The first sign came just before 10 o'clock. Olivia was arranging crystal glasses along a serving table when the music softened unexpectedly. Conversation slowed. Heads turned toward the center of the ballroom. One by one, the kingdom's most eligible young women began stepping forward. Some wore gowns embroidered with silver thread. Others carried themselves with the confidence of people who had spent their entire lives being admired. Their smiles were graceful. Their posture flawless. Everyone understood what was happening. The moon-choosing festival had entered its most important stage. Olivia watched from the edge of the room as the first noblewoman approached Lucien. The woman curtsied elegantly and offered a greeting polished by years of etiquette lessons. Lucien listened. Nodded once. Spoke a few quiet words. The woman smiled politely before returning to the crowd. A few minutes later, another stepped forward. Then another. Then another. Each interaction ended the same way. Respectful. Courteous. Brief. None of them remained beside him. None of them seemed capable of crossing whatever invisible distance separated the king from everyone else. Whispers began spreading through the hall. Perhaps he already chose someone. Maybe none of them are suitable. Maybe he does not intend to choose anyone at all. The uncertainty grew with every passing minute. Olivia carried a tray through the crowd and caught fragments of dozens of conversations. Excitement had slowly transformed into nervous anticipation. The council members on the balcony looked increasingly uncomfortable. Several exchanged worried glances. One advisor checked the massive moonstone clock mounted above the ballroom doors. Midnight was approaching. Something about that seemed important. Very important. Olivia could feel it. As she passed beneath the balcony, two council members stepped into a nearby corridor, unaware she was close enough to hear. Their voices remained low, but a few words reached her clearly. "If he refuses again," one said. "The agreement activates at sunrise," the other replied. "The alliance cannot be delayed any longer." Olivia slowed her steps. "Alliance? Sunrise?" The first speaker sighed heavily. "Then the council will make the announcement themselves." The second man did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of concern. He will not be happy about it. Their footsteps faded down the corridor. Olivia stood frozen for a moment. A strange heaviness settled in her chest. She did not understand the details, but one thing felt obvious. The king was running out of time. Back inside the ballroom, Lucien remained near the windows. The moonlight painted silver edges along his dark coat. Guests continued watching him from a distance. Waiting. Hoping. Speculating. Yet no one seemed interested in what he wanted. They discussed alliances. Politics. Expectations. Duties. Never once did they speak about the man himself. Olivia found herself looking toward him again. This time she noticed something she had missed before. He was not watching the crowd. He was watching the moon. As though the answers everyone demanded from him could somehow be found beyond the glass. For the first time all evening, her heart ached for him. Not because he was a king. Not because he was powerful. But because he looked like someone carrying a decision nobody else could understand. By the time the moon reached its highest point above the palace gardens, the atmosphere inside the Grand Moon Hall had changed completely. The excitement that had filled the evening now carried an edge of tension. Guests smiled less. Conversations grew quieter. Even the musicians seemed aware that something important was slipping away with every passing minute. Olivia moved carefully through the crowd carrying a tray of sparkling water when a sudden burst of laughter caught her attention. Near the center of the ballroom, several young noblewomen stood gathered around a tall woman in a sapphire gown. The woman was beautiful, confident, and clearly accustomed to being the center of attention. Olivia recognized her immediately. Lady Victoria Hawthorne, daughter of one of the wealthiest alpha families in the kingdom. Victoria had spent most of the evening positioning herself where the king might notice her. Unfortunately for her, Lucien had not approached once. Perhaps His Majesty is simply overwhelmed, Victoria said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. After all, choosing among so many exceptional women cannot be easy. Polite laughter followed. Olivia lowered her eyes and continued walking. Unfortunately, her path carried her directly behind the group. As she passed, another noblewoman reached for a glass at the same moment Olivia adjusted her tray. The movement caused a few drops of water to splash onto the marble floor. It was barely noticeable. But Victoria noticed. Her smile widened immediately. Well, she said, turning toward Olivia. At least someone here has finally made an impression tonight. More laughter. Olivia felt heat rise into her face. I am sorry, my lady. Of course you are. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Tell me, do they hire anyone to serve at these events now? Several guests exchanged amused looks. Nobody defended her. Nobody objected. Olivia stared at the floor. The familiar feeling returned. The feeling of becoming small. Invisible. Embarrassed. She could have walked away. Normally she would have. Yet before she could move, another voice joined the conversation. Leave the girl alone. The words came from Martha. The elderly housekeeper stood nearby with her arms folded. Victoria blinked. Clearly she had not expected anyone to intervene. I was only joking. Martha's expression remained unchanged. Then perhaps find a joke that requires less cruelty. Silence settled briefly over the group. Victoria's smile tightened. Without another word, she turned back toward her companions. The conversation resumed. The laughter returned. But something inside Olivia had shifted. She thanked Martha quietly and moved away. A few minutes later, she found herself standing beside one of the ballroom's rear columns, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Across the room, she spotted Lucien once again. He had seen everything. She knew it immediately. Not because he reacted. He had not moved at all. But for a brief second, their eyes met across the crowded hall. There was no pity in his gaze. No judgment. Only understanding. And somehow that felt far more dangerous to her heart than the laughter ever had. Olivia should have returned to work immediately. Instead, she remained beside the column long after the laughter had faded. Her hands were steady again, but her thoughts refused to settle. Across the ballroom, Lucien had already turned his attention back toward the moonlit gardens. Yet the brief look they had shared lingered in her mind. Not because he was the Alpha King. Not because he was the most powerful man in the kingdom. But because, for one impossible moment, she had felt understood. The realization unsettled her. Olivia spent the next hour moving through the hall almost automatically. She carried trays. Refilled glasses. Smiled when required. But her attention kept drifting toward the windows. Toward the solitary figure standing beneath the silver glow of moonlight. Midnight came and went. The great moonstone clock chimed 12 times. Each note echoed through the hall like a warning. Guests exchanged nervous glances. Council members spoke in increasingly urgent whispers. The celebration continued, yet everyone seemed aware that something important had failed to happen. No Luna had been chosen. Olivia was collecting empty glasses near one of the side corridors when raised voices drifted through a partially open door. She immediately looked away. Eavesdropping was improper. Yet a familiar voice stopped her. "I will not do it. Lucien." The words were calm, but firm. Another voice answered. "Your Majesty, with respect, sunrise is only hours away." Olivia froze. "Then sunrise will arrive." Silence followed. Then another advisor spoke. "The alliance agreement was signed 2 years ago. If no Luna is chosen tonight, the council must proceed." "That is your concern," Lucien replied. "Not mine." Olivia felt her heartbeat quicken. She should leave. She knew she should. Yet something in his voice held her there. Not anger. Not frustration. Exhaustion. The sound of a man who had spent too long being told what his future should look like. "The kingdom needs stability," an advisor insisted. "The kingdom needs honesty." Lucien's reply came immediately. "A marriage built on obligation serves no one." The corridor fell silent again. A few moments later, footsteps approached. Olivia hurried away before anyone emerged. But the conversation stayed with her. By the time she returned to the ballroom, everything looked different. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled. Guests still smiled. Music still floated through the air. Yet beneath the beauty she now saw something else. Pressure. Expectations. Demands. Everyone wanted something from the king. A political alliance. A powerful marriage. A perfect queen. Nobody seemed to ask what he wanted. Olivia glanced toward the windows again. Lucien stood exactly where he had been all night. Alone. Waiting for a sunrise he clearly did not welcome. A strange ache settled in her chest. She understood what it felt like when others decided your worth before learning who you were. She understood what it felt like to be trapped by expectations. And suddenly the distance between a forgotten Omega servant and the Alpha King no longer felt quite as impossible as it should have. For the first time all evening, an unexpected thought entered her mind. If everyone else was too afraid to truly see him, perhaps someone should. The thought should have disappeared the moment it appeared. Olivia knew that. She was a servant. An Omega. A woman whose name most guests would forget before the evening ended. Yet no matter how hard she tried to focus on her duties, the feeling remained. Someone should. Someone should walk across that empty space. Someone should speak to him as a person instead of a title. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the ballroom grew quieter. Many guests had stopped pretending confidence. The hopeful excitement from earlier had faded into anxious speculation. Noble families whispered among themselves. Council members checked the moonstone clock with increasing concern. Several young women who had spent the evening hoping for attention now sat together looking disappointed and exhausted. Still, Lucien stood alone beside the windows. Olivia stared at him from across the room. Then she looked away. Then she looked back again. Her pulse quickened. This was ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. What was she even thinking? She could barely speak without becoming nervous when noble guests addressed her. The idea of approaching the Alpha King was impossible. Yet another thought followed immediately. Everyone else thinks so too. That realization struck her harder than expected. Nobody approached him because nobody believed they could. Nobody spoke honestly because everyone feared saying the wrong thing. Nobody crossed the distance because they had convinced themselves the distance was permanent. Olivia remembered the conversation she had overheard. Sunrise is only hours away. She remembered the exhaustion in Lucien's voice. The loneliness she had seen in his eyes. The understanding he had shown her after Victoria's humiliation. Without realizing it, Olivia had stopped moving. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier than before. Olivia? Martha appeared beside her. Are you feeling well? Olivia blinked. I think so. The older woman studied her face carefully. You look like someone standing at the edge of a cliff. Olivia let out a nervous laugh. Maybe I am. Martha followed her gaze toward the windows. Toward the king. Something softened in the older woman's expression. The things that change our lives rarely feel comfortable beforehand. Olivia swallowed. What if people laugh? Martha smiled gently. People laughed tonight anyway. The simple truth of those words settled deep inside her. Across the ballroom, the moonlight continued spilling across the marble floor like liquid silver. Lucien remained alone. Waiting. The clock ticked steadily toward dawn. Olivia drew a slow breath. Then another. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it. Every instinct told her to stay where she was. To remain invisible. Safe. Forgotten. Instead, she set down her tray. Nearby conversations continued. Music drifted softly through the hall. Nobody noticed her at first. One careful step. Then another. She began crossing the ballroom. Halfway there, a few guests turned to watch. Confused whispers followed. An Omega servant was walking directly toward the Alpha King. The whispers spread quickly. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. The closer she came, the quieter the room became. By the time Olivia reached the edge of the moonlit space surrounding Lucien, nearly every eye in the ballroom was fixed on her. Her hands trembled. Her throat felt dry. Lucien slowly turned toward her. Silver eyes met hers. Calm. Curious. Waiting. The entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath. And somehow, despite her fear, Olivia found the courage to take one final step forward. The silence felt endless. Hundreds of people stood frozen beneath the crystal lights, watching a moment nobody could quite understand. Olivia's pulse thundered in her ears. Every instinct urged her to retreat. Yet she remained where she was, standing before the most powerful man in the kingdom with trembling hands and a racing heart. Lucien regarded her quietly. He did not appear surprised. If anything, he looked more attentive than he had all evening. The realization gave her just enough courage to speak. Your Majesty, she said softly. Her voice barely carried across the moonlit space between them. She swallowed and tried again. Everyone keeps waiting for you to choose someone. A few shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one spoke to the king this way. Not nobles. Not advisors. Certainly not servants. Yet Lucien simply listened. Olivia drew another breath. But nobody seems to care what you want. The ballroom became even quieter. Somewhere behind her, a glass clinked against a table. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Lucian's silver eyes remained fixed on hers. For the first time all evening, something shifted in his expression. The faintest trace of surprise. Then understanding. Olivia's heart squeezed painfully. She could see the exhaustion now. Not physical exhaustion. Something deeper. The weight of years spent carrying expectations that belonged to everyone except himself. She glanced briefly toward the council balcony. Several advisors looked horrified. Others looked stunned. Then she looked back at Lucian. You should not have to spend your life trapped by other people's plans. The words escaped before she could stop them. Gasps spread through the room. Olivia immediately felt heat rush into her cheeks. She had gone too far. Much too far. Yet instead of ending the conversation, Lucian asked a question. And what would you suggest? His voice was calm and low, carrying easily through the silence. Olivia blinked. She had not expected him to answer. The entire ballroom seemed to lean forward. Waiting. Watching. Holding its breath. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Not the king. Not the title. Just the man standing alone beneath the moonlight. Then a strange sense of certainty settled over her. It arrived so suddenly she could not explain it. She only knew that for the first time all evening, fear loosened its grip on her heart. A small smile touched her lips. Choose someone who sees you. The words hung in the air. Lucian stared at her. The crowd stared at both of them. The moonlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter somehow, casting silver reflections across the marble floor. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then something remarkable happened. The distant tension Olivia had sensed around him all night seemed to ease. His shoulders relaxed. The guarded expression he carried like armor softened. Not completely. Just enough for her to glimpse the man hidden beneath the crown. Around them, whispers exploded across the ballroom. Yet neither Olivia nor Lucian appeared to hear them. In that moment, the crowded hall, the council, the expectations, and the approaching sunrise all seemed to fade away. There was only the king and the shy Omega who had somehow found the courage to stand before him when no one else would. For a long moment, Lucian said nothing. The silence stretched across the ballroom like a held breath. Hundreds of guests stood motionless beneath the crystal chandeliers, waiting for the king to respond. Olivia suddenly became aware of every eye fixed upon her. The realization should have filled her with panic. Instead, she found herself focused only on the man standing before her. Lucian's gaze never left hers. Then, slowly, something extraordinary happened. He smiled. It was not a large smile. Not the practiced expression of a ruler greeting guests. It was genuine. Small. Quiet. Real. Shock rippled through the crowd. Several council members looked as though they had forgotten how to breathe. Olivia stared at him in disbelief. Somehow that simple smile transformed him more than any royal title ever could. For the first time all evening, he no longer looked distant. He looked human. Olivia Hart, Lucian said softly. Her eyes widened. She had never told him her name. Around the ballroom, whispers erupted immediately. Lucian ignored them. Do you know what everyone here sees when they look at me? Olivia hesitated before answering. A king. He shook his head. A crown. A symbol. A responsibility. His voice remained calm. Very few people ever see anything else. The truth in those words settled heavily over the room. Lucian took a single step closer. Not enough to overwhelm her. Just enough to close a small part of the distance that had separated him from everyone all night. Tonight, he continued, hundreds of people came hoping to gain something from me. His silver eyes softened. You were the first person who asked what I wanted. Olivia felt her throat tighten. Across the ballroom, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the musicians seemed frozen. Lucien looked briefly toward the council balcony. For years, they have searched for the perfect queen. Then he returned his attention to Olivia. But perfection was never what I needed. The words hung in the air. Olivia's heart pounded. She could hardly believe this was happening. Then Lucien did something nobody expected. The Alpha King lowered himself onto one knee before her. Gasps echoed throughout the hall. Several guests covered their mouths in disbelief. Olivia stood completely frozen. "Your Majesty," she whispered. Lucien smiled again. "I spent this entire evening waiting for someone brave enough to cross the room." Emotion shimmered behind his silver eyes. "It turns out I was waiting for you." Tears stung Olivia's eyes before she could stop them. Not from sadness. From the overwhelming impossibility of the moment. The forgotten Omega. The invisible servant. The woman nobody noticed. Lucien extended his hand toward her. "If you are willing," he said quietly, "I would like to begin with a conversation." Soft laughter rippled through the stunned crowd. Even Olivia laughed through her tears. The simplicity of the answer somehow made the moment even more meaningful. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Warmth spread through her chest. Not magic. Not destiny. Something gentler. Hope. Around them, the ballroom remained silent. Then Martha began clapping. One pair of hands became 2. Then 10. Then hundreds. The sound filled the hall as guests rose to their feet. Yet Olivia barely heard it. Her attention remained fixed on Lucien. As the first faint light of dawn appeared beyond the palace windows, the king and the Omega stood together. Beneath the fading moonlight. And for the first time in many years, neither of them looked alone.